Tonight on This Week, it's Cut Price Telly. Star of the screen, Julian Rhind-Tutt, don't worry boss, we're not paying him a bean, tells us why we need to give the thumbs up to Europe.
In a few brief moments, I will be talking effortlessly and articulately about why Great Britain should embrace and celebrate its membership of the European Union.
But it hardly ever rains in Lisbon, does it? We turn to the actor, Julian Rhind-Tutt. Crazy name, crazy guy, who wouldn't get out of bed for the measly fee we could afford to pay him. This is his take of the week.
The biggest worry I have about Europe and the pro-European position is that even a flagship programme on the BBC had to come and find a fluffy-haired, unemployed actor to take the pro-European position. But that aside, it has always struck me in this enormous institution, with all its potential of corruption and lumbering bureaucracy and ridiculous decisions and edicts, wouldn't it be far better to be inside reforming that institution from within? You've got to be in it to win it. One of the other things that puzzles me about the anti-European position is that there are constant assertions that it will somehow affect our cultural heritage and our British way of life. And I'm always thinking, well, if you look at Ireland, this extraordinary, prosperous nation, changed beyond all recognition in the last few years, completely embraced its membership of the European Union. I look at Ireland and I don't see any erosion of their day-to-day cultural life, their extraordinary history, their heritage. If I see any threat to it, if you were to walk down a high street in an Irish city, probably the most debilitating effects would be from global forces or corporate forces. You might see too many branches of Starbucks or too many global brands. But I don't think you could really say that the grants that have built their sewage system, improved their roads, helped their economic expansion, have really deteriorated or eroded their great history and their wonderful cultural identity. Sure, that should be straighter. Did some emergency homework. We've had 62 years of peace in Europe. We've had 57 years of a European Union. We, the United Kingdom, have been in the European Union already for 34 years. The whole thing brought together to preserve peace in Europe and to try and make sure that the appalling conflicts of the 20th century were never repeated. Surely it's fairly obvious that the best position for Britain to be in is at the centre of that institution, controlling the destiny of Europe, standing up for the great patriotic British values of democracy, fair play, honesty and integrity, parliamentary democracy, bringing these proud British ideas into the heart of Europe so that we are controlling its destiny.
Julian Rhind-Tutt at home in West London. He has managed to make it to our modest little home here in Westminster. He did, of course, walk because we couldn't afford the taxi fare. Thanks for being here. Now, it's all very well to talk about this great pro-European state of mind that you have, but this government has put so many caveats, protocols, opt-ins, opt-outs to the treaty. What's the point of signing it?
Over to you.
Well, I was about to say that I thought we ought to just establish for the viewer, Julian, that they're so confident about their sceptical arguments, these three, that they only allowed two of us on the programme to actually argue the toss with them. But, I mean, the key point,
What's he talking about?
You know.
What's he on about?
You're overrepresented by comparison with the population.
Well, I'm not sure about that. I think that if
So,
it came to a straight
I mean, this treaty's become so complicated now, no one understands it.
We've had an enormous increase in the membership of the European Union, which has now nearly doubled to 27 member states. And if you're going to have a certain amount of sensible decision-taking, you've got to have rules about majority voting, for example, some of which are very much in our interest. We want as a country to liberalise and open up the markets on energy.
Why does that take 36,000 words?
Well, it's only a fourth or a third of the amount of words that were in the Constitutional Treaty, which you say is exactly the same thing. So I'm glad that we've started by admitting that this is an extremely different document.
Really? Who else admits that?
Well, I think that if you look at the European Union Scrutiny Committee, which looked at this, the House of Commons Scrutiny Committee said very clearly that unless you take account of the opt-outs, it's a similar treaty, but once you take account of the opt-outs, it's very different for the UK.
Do you feel in your pro-European attitude that you're in a minority in this country?
Yes, but that's because all the votes say no, 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 no. But then there's obviously huge...
It's not actually true. There's a majority vote in favour on staying...
Just because we're not paying you a fee doesn't mean say you don't have to answer the questions.
I'm a lamb to the slaughter. I'm out of my league. Look, I'm sitting next
That was
to
an
the-
easy question.
sitting
Where do you
next to
see the next
leader
one?
of the Liberal Democrat Party.
What's
Well,
this
let's not
Hugh's
get
excuse for
carried
answering
away.
questions that he wasn't asked?
Isn't it better to get in there?
precedent, Michael.
He's not running for. He's not running for the
I'm
Liberal
in the presence
leadership.
of the master here.
I can only...
I tell you what is I think is a serious point here, particularly for the British situation. There are so many protocols and opt-outs and opt-ins and caveats and derogations and so on. You really need to be like a Brussels lawyer to understand this.
I think
Whose fault is it that there are all these deregulations
this
and
is-
regulations?
this is-
the
we
Eurosceptics
have
who
gone.
created them anyway.
We have gone and we've said we are prepared to agree this treaty for all the rest of you, providing that we are removed from its provisions on crime, removed from its provisions on guaranteeing a Charter of Fundamental Rights, which is something
5
that
years.
CBI was very much in favour of. And so you can have it. We will go ahead and allow that to be granted to the rest of the EU, providing we're actually opted out. Now, that's a slightly messy position, but it's at least one that doesn't justify, in my view, having a referendum on an issue when we've actually exempted ourselves from the main provisions.
Diane.
Can I just say that I'm not anti-Europe, and actually I have nothing in principle against a federal Europe and loss of sovereignty. What I object to is a dishonest political debate when people are trying to pretend, for instance, that something which is clearly the same as the old constitution is not, that we're not moving towards greater federalism. I might welcome greater federalism, as I say, but it's a dishonest political debate being led by elites. I have to tell you, Chris, that the benefits of free movement within the EU are not immediately obvious to my constituency in Hackney, both black and white, who are now having to compete with, you know, highly skilled labour for Eastern Europe. We need to have an honest debate with people. Otherwise, it leads to cynicism about politicians, which is bad for all
That
of
is
us.
precisely why I think it's actually very sensible.
But it's dishonest not to. It's dishonest of you not to admit that this is actually the same as the old constitution, and therefore,
It isn't the same. And it isn't the same when you take account
yeah, but
of
there's
the
only a
opt-outs.
few Lib Dems that say that.
That's
really,
not true.
You know,
And the whole of the government that nominally, Diane, you're meant to be
Well, the
supporting.
government has to say it to avoid a referendum,
yeah,
doesn't it?
because
Should we
if
have
we
a
had a
referendum,
referendum,
Julian?
we'd lose.
Tricky one. Probably. Tricky one. Tricky one.
should have
We're
a
not-
That's a great answer.
we're not legally obliged to have a referendum. We made a promise that we would have, but actually we've got democratically elected members of the European Parliament. They've been in power.
But they did make a
We've been
promise.
elected
in the
there for 28
they got
years.
elected on a manifesto that promised a referendum.
It's a manifesto commitment, so
It's a manifesto
it's
commitment.
embarrassing,
Yeah, but it's not
but it's a
strictly
manifesto
this-
commitment.
Michael, would you like to let them have the other barrel?
Oh, that's unfair.
I think essentially this treaty brings in about 50 areas which are now going to be decided by qualified majority voting, which were not there before. And that qualified majority voting is made up differently from before because they've changed the proportions that each country has in the votes. And that is a pretty important shift away from the things that Britain can settle for itself towards things that can be settled by the majority of countries in the European Union. I think that the House Commons Scrutiny Committee said that this is substantially the same thing. Nearly all European leaders have said that it's the same thing. They've varied in their estimate of the extent to which it's the same thing between 90 and 98%, but those are both very high percentages. And I think that Gordon Brown, as a man who said that he was going to trust the people and be transparent and do away with spin, does himself a grave injustice by not allowing us to have a referendum on something which is so much the same.
Gordon Brown from Michael or anybody else, because I have a lot to criticise in what he does. But the reality is that the promise that Labour Party and we made to have a referendum was on a constitutional treaty which didn't, at that stage, involve any opt-outs at all. We have an opt-out from the Charter of Fundamental Rights. We have an opt-out from
There
criminal...
were 4 red lines. There were 4 red lines in the first constitutional treaty. 2 of them the exact same as the red lines in this new treaty. The other 2 have been tweaked, though not substantively. It is just, Chris, it just isn't true to say that there were no red lines in the first.
I'm not saying red lines, because there are red lines about the actual content of the treaty. But what I'm talking about is the extent of the opt-outs. And if, when you're saying, you know, this is 90% of the treaty, which is what various... Yes, like the Belgian Prime Minister. He's talking about a treaty which doesn't have opt-outs.
Now,
that is, it seems to me...
You know what, Chris?
Let's be honest.
You know what, Chris? Go out and sell your vision of federal Europe. It's a genuinely worthy vision, but don't treat the public like fools. That is what I object to. That's what I object to.
I do not want a federal Europe. I want a Europe of nations.
Should we have a referendum?
But we do. I think it's very sensible to do what the Eurosceptics have been asking for years, which is that as soon as we get the Reform Treaty on the statute book, for the first time we will actually have a clause which the Eurosceptics have been asking for years, allowing us to secede, and we should have a referendum on that. Because that is the point. That is the point.
Yeah,
final point.
Might win that one.
Eurosceptics actually really want
Do you think, Julian, that
Why
this
should we?
country... Excuse me, I'm speaking to Julian. They're just they're such a useful shower. Will this country, do you think, ever embrace Europe the way you would like it to?
That's exciting. No, because I think it'll take many, many more years for us to evolve. We have these wonderful positive characteristics of fair play and patriotism, which I'm in full support of. We also have these problems of xenophobia and a slight, I think, superiority complex and mistrust of our continental neighbours.
Julian, can I put a
Unlike
point
the Germans. No, they all have them. Yeah.
In your film, last paragraph, you said that it would be great to be at the heart of Europe and to extend to the rest of Europe, for example, our idea of parliamentary democracy. Yes. Aren't you a bit shocked that when we're meant to be spreading our ideas about democracy, actually our government, having promised a referendum, is now denying us a referendum?
I am. And I knew if I came on this programme, I would find your arguments compelling and powerful.
And on that
I totally agree. I totally agree.
On that
if I was the voice behind, because I would say, no, we shouldn't have a referendum because we'll lose it. But you see,
well, on both shock and honesty, we have to leave it there. Could you make a contribution to the programme?
I would love to, but I've worked for the BBC for so many
years.
Get
you. The producer will
stop
get
Andrew having to slum it on Jonathan Ross's rations. So.
I'm not cutting down to Mr. Ross's rations. Julian, thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
Now, stop falling.